So we're talking about learning styles this week. So I'm just going to briefly go over in this PowerPoint kind of a brief introduction to each different style and then the importance of like why does this matter. You'll go in more detail about the styles in your chapter in your textbook. Great. So there are a variety of learning styles out there, and it varies from person to person as to which style they prefer. It can also vary from class for one person, right? So, like for example, I prefer diagrams and pictures for biology, but if I'm taking a history class, I actually just prefer like a regular like written word auditory. That's the word I'm looking for. Auditory. Sometimes people prefer combinations of multiple ones, and they can change over time. So maybe you prefer, visual when you were in high school, but now you're like, I really prefer auditory or whatever. So they can change over time. So visual learners. So visual learners are people who prefer pictures, diagrams. They like to see things. They like to picture it. Sometimes they'll draw stuff out. So for example, this is like a diagram of muscle contraction. So, for example, as someone who is a visual learner, specifically for like biology courses, I like to see the mechanism, right? Like I like to see muscle contraction drawn out rather than written out. It's easier for me to see it as a picture. Like I said, sometimes I'll draw stuff out in their notes. I frequently have drawn out like even if it's just a simple diagram, like or a simple just like chain reaction, kind of this goes that, in my notes of like fatty synthesis or something like that. Tactile learners. So tactile learners are people who prefer more of the physical activities. They like working with their hands. They like that hands-on work. So these people tend to thrive in like labs and experimentation. They prefer just so well, let me try it myself. Um, this is a little harder for some classes than others, right? So like in your science classes, you definitely have like labs, right? You have lab work where you can do it yourself. And try it out. Where other classes are a little more hard. For example, like history or English is a little more hard to like get that hands-on work experience other than if you consider writing maybe hands-on, but usually like I said, they thrive in their labs. An example of a tactile learner, someone who really likes to just get down to work here is Iron Man, which is why he's pictured here. Auditory learners. So auditory learners prefer to hear and listen to things, and that's how they take in information. Sometimes they like to record lectures. They can listen to them later. A lot of these people you might notice they prefer an audio book to like just reading a book. Maybe they prefer podcasts as their way of getting information as opposed to just looking it up online. Um, I prefer being auditory for some of my history classes for whatever reason. Just listening to the information is easier in history than just reading it. But that would be an example of that. Then we have reading and writing. So people who prefer just to read the information, they can just read a book, they've got it, no worries, or they prefer writing it out in their notes. You usually think of these people in like traditional style lectures where, the professor has a PowerPoint, they're just writing, taking notes, or they're reading their book before class, and that's how they're taking their notes. So picture here is Sam and Gilly from Game of Thrones. They would be considered like reading and writing preferred, right? Sam can just read a book and he has that information with him. That's pretty much it for this. All right, the other thing to remember about learning is also there's other things like working in groups or working individually. Some people find it easier to work in a group setting, right? They enjoy the lab, right? Working with partners. Maybe they enjoy the group projects. They enjoy like collaborating with other people, bouncing ideas off of other people. While other people prefer learning on their own, right? Like they take information much easier. They find it easier to focus if they're just by themselves. They prefer to study alone. They don't really like the group work because, not necessarily because group work is frustrating in and of itself, but like they prefer it. They find it easier to study or gather information if they're just doing it alone by themselves. Another thing too is when you're thinking about is also like the sound level of where you are. So some people study better when there's noise. There's something going on in the backgrounds, whether it's TV, music, people talking, etc. I'm one of these people. For example, this is actually a screenshot from one of my Spotify playlists that I usually put on if I'm studying or doing something to focus. I have to have noise. I grew up in a noisy household, so I need noise on. Other people, though, prefer quiet. They want silence. They want it, maybe not silence, but they want like a very maybe white noise on in the background. So why do we need to know all this? Finding out what works for you is going to help you study better. So when you're studying, pay attention to kind of your study habits. Do you find you study better and you take in and learn that information better when you're in a group or when you're by yourself? Well, for example, if you're like, well, I actually find that I learn better if I'm with a group of people, okay, great. Seek that out. Put together a study group. Come into tutoring where there's a lot of people and you can study together. If you prefer to study, you say, no, I do better if I'm alone. Okay, well then make sure you study alone. Make sure you're not being dragged into a study group that you are not going to be successful in. Same thing with the noise level. Like, do you notice that you get really distracted when there's a lot of noise going on? You can't focus. Okay, so that means when you go to study, you need to make sure that you turn all that noise off. You go into your bedroom, shut the door, make sure there's no distractions. It's finding out what works for you so that way you can study and learn successfully. And the same thing too with like the different learning styles. If you find that you prefer visual, like you're like, I love diagrams and pictures, lean into that. When you're taking your notes, put diagrams, put pictures, draw things out. You can print stuff off in the library if you want to add pictures to your notes, or you can make copies of things, put pictures in there. And also pay attention to class, because remember I said that sometimes it changes for class. If you notice you do better with maybe auditory for, say, English class, then kind of lean into that for your English class of just listening and paying attention, and then using, whatever learning style. And that's all learning styles are, is like I said, it's just figuring out what works for you so that way you can study successfully, you can take notes well, and that you are going to pass all your classes and succeed.